G'day Internet, Chris here. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this brand new crosscut sled. It's got a hold down on either side of the blade. These enable you to hold tricky bits of wood so you don't get your fingers in the way. It's got not one but two stop blocks, which is probably overkill. A stop block is probably the most important feature of a crosscut sled. It enables you to set a single measurement and make repeatable cuts, ensuring that every piece of wood you cut is exactly the same size. Part of this video will be showing you how to true up your fence as well, using a technique called the 5-cut method. But before we get into the build, I want to show you something else. So this is my first crosscut sled, and it's pretty bare bones, but you could probably make it with what you have in your woodworking shed right now. It really is just a bit of MDF and some ply or MDF for the front and back fences. And the runners are made from some scrap Quila from the local big box timber yard. While it's nice to have all the bells and whistles that I'm going to add to the new one, you can still do a lot of things with this. So for example, for your stop block, all you need is a scrap of wood and a clamp. Clamp your bit of wood on, and then you've got repeatable cuts. Another super simple safety tip I learned from another YouTuber was to get a simple pencil with a rubber on the end and use that to hold your piece of wood. That way you're not getting your fingers in the way of the blade. Alright, we're going to kick into this project by cutting out the bed of the sled. I'm choosing to use 19mm or 3/4 inch MDF as it's cheap and stable. Plywood's another good option, but you'll want to watch out for warping. The size really depends on what you want to use it for. You may end up creating a large and a small sled for different situations. This sled ended up being 620mm by 900mm. I found the large size worked well, and when not in use it helped protect my table saw from condensation of my garage. For the front fence, I'm going to laminate 3 pieces of the same MDF together. You can get away with only 2 pieces, but for me the size of the aluminium track that rides along the top was too wide for only 2 strips. The width of these strips are 80mm or roughly 3 inches, and that's specific to the stop blocks I want to install. I originally used plywood here, but after I'd glued it up I noticed a bow in the piece, and not wanting to deal with that, I decided to make a new one with MDF instead. The back fence doesn't matter so much if it's straight or not, as it won't have anything to do with the accuracy of your cut. So I made mine out of 2 strips of 18mm or 3/4 inch ply. These strips are 120mm or roughly 4 3/4 inches wide. This is pretty arbitrary and we're going to shape them to look nicer later on. On to the glue up. I picked up this handy roll of plastic from a local sewing and crafts shop, which makes cleanup from glue mess super easy and protects your work surface too. With our fences drying, we can move on to securing the runners to the sled. I chose to buy a couple of strips of polyethylene as they're pretty cheap and precision made, but you can easily make your own, preferably out of a hardwood. To glue them down, you want to start off by adding a few washes or coins into the tracks to raise the strips up so they'll make contact with the sled. With the runners in place, add some CA glue to both runners and then spray some kicker on the sled. Now, using your fence as a guide, gently lower the sled down onto the runners and apply pressure for about a minute or so. Don't worry about being super accurate here, as we're going to deal with that later on. When you're sure the glue is set, carefully flip the sled over, and now we're going to secure the runners with screws. It's a good idea to use a screwdriver to drive the screws in here, as too much pressure could cause the polyethylene to bulge, or if you're using hardwood it could split. And while we have the sled flipped over, it's a good idea to apply a layer or 2 of paste wax. The main reason for this is to ensure that the sled slides nicely on the table saw, but it also gives the MDF a little protection from moisture. Now that the fences are glued, I skim them with a table saw to clean off any glue scum, and then I cut them to final length on the miter saw. I don't actually want my back fence to be as tall as it is, but I do want extra strength where the blade is going to cut through. So I make a mark where the blade will be, and then I draw a raised section around that mark, using a random pot to get some nice curves. I then take the fence over to the table saw to cut it as close as I can to the raised section. And then I take it over to the bandsaw to finish cutting out the shape. I should also mention that this is purely cosmetic at this point. I just like my creations to look nice even if they're just tools. And because I didn't do a very nice job on the bandsaw, I used the spindle sander to clean up the rough edges. And finally, I use a round over bit in my router to get rid of those nasty sharp edges. Moving on to fabricating the front fence, we want to cut a recess in the front fence for the aluminium track that the stop blocks will attach to. Now we've got our front fence cut, what we want to do is recess this little rail into the front fence. We want our stop block to be able to come down and almost touch the bottom there. So let's go and cut that on the table saw. The easiest way to cut this rabbit is by using the track itself as a guide to set up your saw height and your fence position. When cutting a rabbet on your table saw like this, it's important to consider the order of your cuts. You want the wood to be properly supported when the final cut is made. I add a very small chamfer to the bottom of the front fence where it faces the blade. This essentially creates a channel for stray sawdust to go so it doesn't shift the piece of wood you're cutting. And while I've got the router out, I add a nice little round over to the top of the fence. Before I can attach the fences, I want to add a few strips of T-track to the sled. These will allow me to use hold downs to keep things in place without getting my fingers too close to the blade. To work out where I wanted the T-track, I added one of the hold downs and positioned the T-track so that the hold down would be a few centimeters or an inch away from where the blade would be, and then took a measurement from that. After making my measurements, I used a router with a 1/2 inch spiral upcut bit to cut the dado in 2 passes. I used a piece of wood clamped to the workpiece as a fence for the first pass, and for the second pass I added a small shim against the fence to shift the router over. It's perfectly fine to use a circular saw of some sort to cut your aluminium T-track. Just don't use a saw stop if you have one. To attach the T-track, I'm going to use both screws and epoxy, which might be a bit overkill, but better safe than sorry. You'll notice that my T-track doesn't quite come to the end of my sled. This is not only to account for the rear fence, but I also need a gap to allow me to insert and remove the T-bolts for the hold downs as I need them. Now we're ready to attach the back fence, and we don't need to be super precise here. Simply clamp it in place, flip it over and drill some countersunk holes before attaching with several screws. Just be sure you don't add any screws to where the blade will cut. Going back to the front fence, it's time to cut my aluminium track down to size and attach it to the fence. I'm using a self-centering drill bit here to drill the holes, as I don't want the track to shift when I screw it down. At this point, we're only going to attach the front fence with 2 screws, as we're going to adjust it later on using a technique called the 5-cut method. This first screw is what I will refer to later on as the pivot screw, and it's going to play a pivotal part in adjusting the fence later on. It's not really important where you put the second screw, as we'll be removing it later on during the adjustment phase. Now that everything is together, it's time to cut it in half, which really is just a simple cut on the table saw, raising the saw just high enough that it cuts straight through the bed. Now it's time to true up the fence using the 5-cut method. This can be a bit daunting, so I'm going to break it down as simply as I can, and I'll put the formula in the description below for later reference. First off, you're going to want to grab a scrap of wood, don't worry if it's square or not, and mark the letters A and B as shown in the video. Now we're going to make a series of 4 cuts, starting with our AB side and rotating the piece counterclockwise each time until eventually we've cut all 4 edges of the wood. For the 5th cut, we'd rotate the piece one final time and cut off approximately 30 mils or 1 inch from our AB side. The width of the slice is not really important, and as you can see, I just eyeballed it. From the strip, we're going to take 3 measurements, and from those, we'll be able to calculate our error per unit of measure, be it inch or millimeters. First off, measure the width of the strip at point A, then measure the width of the strip at point B, and finally measure the length of the strip. I'll refer to these measurements as A, B, and length. From this, we can now work out our error per unit, and it doesn't matter if you're using metric or imperial, just sub in your unit that you're using. I'm using metric, so these are millimeters. So we've got A here is 35.24, and B here is 36.82, and then the length between these two is 301. We need to plug that into this formula, and I'll leave that in the description below because it can be a little bit daunting. But essentially the number you end up there is your error per unit. So that's error per inch or error per millimeter. Now that we've got our error per unit, we need to make one final measurement. This is our distance from the pivot. Basically, we need to measure from our pivot screw to the opposite edge of the front fence. So that gave us our distance from the pivot point. In my case, it was 872 mil. And then we take our EPU, or error per unit, that we calculated on that side. Remember that was negative 0. that. So we've got those two numbers. We just multiply them together, and that gives us our adjustment. So in this case, Mine is negative 1.144 millimeters, and being a negative number, it means I want to move the fence towards me. If you have a positive number, you can move the fence away from you. Right, now we've got a measurement. We have our pivot point about here. We need to move this side backwards towards me because I've got a negative number. So we're going to put a little block here. You'll notice that the stop block has an angle cut on it, and that's because I want the adjustment to be made on the very edge of the front fence, and using a point as the stop block ensures I only make contact with that edge. With the stop block marking the original fence position, I can unscrew the temporary screw, enabling the fence to rotate around the pivot screw. With a feeler gauge set to our measurement we calculated earlier, we can shift the fence backwards, clamp it in place, and drill and screw the fence back into place. It's super important not to use the old screw hole here, as if you do, your fence will probably just be forced back into the old position. If your measurement was a positive number and you need to move the fence away from you, you can essentially use the same technique. The difference is that when you clamp your stop block down, use the feeler gauge to space the stop block away from your fence by the required amount before clamping the stop block down. You will then be able to unscrew the fence and push it until it touches the stop block, at which point you can clamp it down and re-screw it as before. At this point your fence should be perfectly square, but it's worth repeating the whole 5-cut process again just to make certain, and when you're finally happy, you can add additional screws to the front fence to secure it better. One of the benefits of the particular aluminium extrusion I'm using is it has a place for a steel ruler. So I purchased a left and a right flexible steel ruler and attached them using the blade as 0. And the stop blocks I purchased have adjustable position markers, so I don't need to be accurate with my ruler placement. The final thing I want to add is a block of wood, or you could make a small box, where the blade comes out the other side of the front fence. This obviously isn't going to stop the blade coming through, but it acts as a reminder of where not to put your fingers when holding the fence and making your cuts. And just for some extra visual reinforcement, a nice big warning sign on the block. And that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed that and found it useful. If you haven't made one of these before, hopefully the one takeaway you can take from this video is it doesn't have to be complex. You don't need all the bells and whistles. You can go down and buy a piece of ply and make something straight away without breaking the bank. As always, if you think I earned it, hit those like and subscribe buttons. And if you're interested in other things I've done, I've got a whole series on how I built my workbench. I'll have a link up here somewhere at some point soon. And with all that, I'll see you in the next video.